You still dress like a college dropout, Caleb, my mother said loudly in the middle of Terminal B at Chicago O'Hare. At your age, that's actually impressive. A few people turned to look at me before quickly pretending they hadn't heard her. The airport smelled like burnt coffee and floor polish, the kind of scent every major airport in America seemed to share. I adjusted the strap of my duffel bag and glanced toward the departure board glowing above us. Our flight to San Francisco was delayed another 40 minutes. Good to see you too, Mom, I said quietly. Diane Whitmore stood beside two oversized designer suitcases wearing a cream cashmere coat that probably cost more than my first car. Her silver blonde hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place despite the February wind outside. Next to her, Howard Sinclair checked his gold watch with visible irritation while my sister Vanessa scrolled through her phone, already bored with the entire family reunion. I'm serious, my mother continued, lowering her sunglasses just enough to study me. Do you ever buy clothes that aren't gray? Vanessa laughed under her breath. Maybe gray is part of the struggling artist look. I smiled faintly. Same dynamic. Same jokes. It didn't matter that I was 38 years old now. Around my family, I somehow became 22 again. The failed son. The one who never quite measured up. My mother had spent years introducing Vanessa as her successful daughter while describing me with phrases like still figuring things out. Even after I stopped explaining myself, she never stopped assuming. Howard picked up one of the carry-on bags and looked me over carefully. So where are you living these days, Caleb? He asked. Seattle. Still. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Expensive city for someone freelancing. I nodded once. It works out. My mother gave a soft laugh that sounded almost pitying. Your brother-in-law just made partner at his law firm, she said. Vanessa and Daniel are already looking at vacation homes in Napa. I could feel the familiar pressure building behind my ribs, that old instinct to defend myself, to finally explain everything. The years, the work, the nights sleeping in my office beside vending machines and cold coffee while everyone else assumed I'd disappeared because I was failing. But experience had taught me something simple. People who enjoy misunderstanding you rarely appreciate being corrected. So instead, I reached for the handle of her suitcase. You should sit down before boarding starts, I said calmly. You've been standing a while. She blinked at me, almost disappointed I hadn't reacted. Then her eyes dropped toward the boarding pass sticking halfway out of my jacket pocket. Her expression shifted slightly, just for a second. Confusion, then suspicion, because above the barcode, in thick black letters, were two words she definitely wasn't expecting to see next to my name. First class. My mother stared at the boarding pass for a second longer than necessary before handing it back to me with a thin smile that did not quite reach her eyes. First class, she said slowly. That is unexpected. Howard chuckled beside her. Maybe the airline made a mistake. Vanessa finally looked up from her phone. Or maybe he spent all his savings trying to impress somebody. I slipped the boarding pass back into my jacket without responding. The truth was, I had spent most of my adult life learning how to sit quietly while people underestimated me. Correcting them always took more energy than it was worth. We moved toward the seating area near gate K-17 while snow drifted softly outside the massive airport windows. Planes taxied through the gray afternoon like giant shadows. My mother walked a few steps ahead of me, still carrying herself with the same polished confidence she had worn my entire life. Diane Whitmore believed appearances explained everything. Expensive watch meant successful man. Wrinkled sweatshirt meant failed son. It had always been that simple for her. I sat near the window and loosened my coat slightly. Across from me, a businessman typed furiously on a laptop while a tired mother tried calming a crying toddler with crackers and apple juice. Airports had a strange way of making everybody look lonely. You know, my mother said suddenly, crossing one elegant leg over the other, your father used to worry about you. I looked up slowly. She rarely mentioned him anymore. He thought you were too sensitive for business. Her voice softened slightly, almost thoughtful. He used to say you lived inside your own head too much. I nodded once. My father had died 8 years earlier, right around the time my first company collapsed. Back then I had been sleeping 4 hours a night, surviving on instant noodles and gas station coffee, while trying to keep 12 employees paid. When the company failed, I lost almost everything except the exhaustion. My mother never understood why I disappeared afterward. She thought I was embarrassed. The truth was simpler than that. I was rebuilding. Quietly. You remember that Christmas after your company shut down? Vanessa asked with a faint laugh. Mom thought you were moving back home permanently. Howard smirked. Nothing wrong with a reset. I could still remember that Christmas perfectly. The silence when I walked into my mother's dining room, carrying a single duffel bag. The careful way everybody avoided asking about money. The look of pity on my sister's face while she passed the mashed potatoes. I had stayed exactly 3 days before driving back to Seattle through freezing rain because I could not stand being looked at like broken furniture. Well, my mother said, adjusting the sleeve of her coat. At least you seem calmer now. Sometimes failure matures people. I looked toward the runway lights glowing against the snow and smiled faintly to myself. She still thought she understood my story. That was the strange thing about family. Once they decide who you are, they stop listening long before you stop changing. Boarding finally began almost an hour later. The line formed slowly near the gate. People gathering their carry-on bags with that exhausted patience travelers always seem to develop in airports. My mother stood beside Howard near group, while Vanessa kept checking her phone every few seconds, probably updating somebody about the delay. I stayed seated near the window until the announcement for first-class passengers came through the speakers. We would now like to welcome our first-class travelers and premium members for priority boarding. I stood up quietly and reached for my duffel bag. At first, my mother did not notice. She was too busy adjusting the scarf around her neck while explaining to Howard why airline food had become absolutely inedible. Then Vanessa looked up and frowned slightly as I stepped toward the priority lane. Caleb, she called out. That line is for first class. A few people nearby glanced in our direction. I stopped walking and looked back calmly. I know. Her expression tightened. Wait, you are serious? Howard gave a short laugh under his breath. Maybe they upgraded him because the flight is not full. The gate agent scanned my boarding pass and smiled politely. Welcome aboard, Mr. Whitmore. It is good to see you again. Again. Such a small word. But I saw the way my mother's face changed when she heard it. Not dramatic. Just subtle enough that most people would have missed it. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if a puzzle piece had landed somewhere it did not belong. I thanked the gate agent and started down the jet bridge without another word. The carpet beneath my shoes softened the sound of my steps while cold air drifted through the tunnel from outside. I could still hear my family talking behind me, their voices quieter now. Suspicious. Confused. I found my seat near the front of the cabin beside the window. Wide leather seat. Warm, overhead lighting. A folded blanket resting neatly beside bottled water and headphones. The flight attendant offered me sparkling water before the rest of the plane had even boarded. I thanked her and loosened my jacket slightly. Through the opening between seats, I could see passengers continuing to file into economy farther back. Then I saw my mother stop in the aisle for just a second after noticing where I was sitting. Her hand tightened around the strap of her purse. Howard leaned closer to say something to her, but she barely reacted. For the first time all afternoon, she looked uncertain. Not angry, not mocking, just unsure. I looked away before our eyes could fully meet. Outside the window, snowflakes moved across the runway lights in slow white streaks. 8 years earlier, after my first company failed, I had flown this exact route sitting in the last row near the bathroom because it was the only seat I could afford. I remembered staring at the seat back in front of me wondering if everybody else on the plane could somehow tell I had failed. Funny how life worked sometimes. The people who once pitted you eventually become the same people trying to figure you out. The plane leveled above the clouds about 30 minutes after takeoff. Most of the cabin had gone quiet except for the low hum of engines and the occasional clink of silverware from the galley. I sat beside the window watching the sunset spread across the horizon in thin bands of orange and blue. There was something strangely peaceful about being above weather. Storms looked smaller from a distance. A flight attendant stopped beside my seat with a warm smile. Mr. Whitmore, your driver confirmed your pickup in San Francisco. Would you also like the car arranged for tomorrow morning? Yes, please, I said. 8:30 if possible. Of course. She smiled politely and walked away. I noticed my mother standing near the front restroom a few feet away. She had clearly heard the conversation because she lingered there longer than necessary, pretending to adjust the bracelet around her wrist. When our eyes met briefly, she looked away first. That almost never happened. An hour later, the curtain between cabins shifted open again and Howard stepped through awkwardly. He gave me a careful smile that felt completely different from earlier at the gate. Softer, more respectful. Mind if I sit for a minute? He asked. I glanced toward the empty seat beside me. Go ahead. He lowered himself carefully and folded his hands together. Diane mentioned you have been doing consulting work in Seattle. There it was. The fishing had started. I kept my expression neutral. Something like that. He nodded slowly. Technology? Mostly. He cleared his throat lightly. That field has changed a lot over the years. Plenty of opportunity now. I almost smiled. Earlier, he had spoken to me like a cautionary tale. Now he sounded like a man trying not to offend somebody important. Funny how quickly tone could change when people sensed money nearby. You know, Howard continued, your mother worries about you. I looked back toward the dark window. No, I said quietly. She worries about appearances. He did not answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, he stood up and adjusted his jacket. Well, he said carefully, it is good to see things working out for you. After he left, I leaned back into the seat and closed my eyes for a moment. My mind drifted years backward again. Tiny apartment in Seattle. Secondhand desk. Rain tapping against the windows while I rewrote software code until 3 a.m. because I could not afford another engineer yet. Nobody saw those years. Nobody saw the cheap frozen dinners or the panic attacks or the nights I stared at spreadsheets wondering how to make payroll by Friday. My family only saw silence. And people often mistake silence for failure. A few minutes later, I felt someone stop beside my seat again. This time it was my mother. She looked down at me with an expression I could not fully recognize. Not warmth. Not exactly guilt either. More like confusion mixed with caution. Caleb, she said softly, why did you never tell us things were going well? I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because every time I tried to tell you anything, I said quietly, you had already decided who I was. My mother remained beside my seat for another few seconds after I answered her. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly for the evening service, soft golden reflections stretching across the windows, while most passengers settled into silence. Diane Whitmore looked strangely smaller standing there in the aisle than she had earlier in the airport terminal. Less certain. I did not mean that, she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. I looked back toward the window. Maybe not intentionally. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to continue, but a flight attendant approached with a polite smile and asked if she needed anything. My mother shook her head quickly and returned to economy without another word. About 20 minutes later, dinner service began. Real plates, warm bread, glasses that were actually made of glass instead of plastic. I noticed the older man seated across the aisle studying me over the edge of his newspaper. Business trip? He asked casually. Something like that. I replied with a faint smile. San Francisco? Yes. He nodded knowingly. Technology? I laughed softly under my breath. Is it that obvious? Only to people who spent 30 years investing in startups, he said. We talked quietly through most of dinner. Artificial intelligence, market shifts, venture capital. The conversation felt natural, easy in a way conversations with my own family never seemed to feel anymore. At one point, the man handed me his business card and said, I have heard your name before. Whitmore Analytics, right? I nodded once. That was one of them. One of them. Even now, I still struggled to speak about success directly. Maybe because for years I had trained myself not to. The older man smiled with genuine respect. Impressive work. My son uses your company software. Before I could answer, I noticed movement near the curtains separating cabins. Vanessa stood there pretending to check the restroom line while clearly listening to every word. The second our eyes met, she looked embarrassed and disappeared back toward economy. An hour later, turbulence shook the cabin lightly as we crossed over Nevada. Most passengers slept through it. I stayed awake staring at the map glowing on the seatback screen while old memories drifted through my mind like shadows. I remembered the first time I asked my mother for a small business loan 15 years earlier. Only $15,000. She had refused politely at the time and later bought Vanessa a luxury SUV for her birthday 2 months afterward. Your sister has stability, she had explained carefully. You chase ideas. That sentence stayed with me longer than she probably ever realized. Somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting belief from anybody. I built my life the same way people survive cold winters. Quietly, one layer at a time. Near midnight, the cabin lights dimmed even further. I pulled out my phone briefly to review a message from my chief financial officer about an acquisition meeting scheduled Monday morning. Numbers filled the screen for a moment before I locked it again. But not before I noticed someone watching from the aisle. My mother, standing completely still beside the curtain with an unreadable expression on her face. Because for the first time in years, she was beginning to understand that the son she pitted had been living an entirely different life than the one she imagined. We landed in San Francisco just after 6 in the morning. The city was still wrapped in pale gray fog as the plane rolled slowly toward the gate. Most passengers immediately reached for their phones the second the wheels touched the runway, but I stayed seated for a moment watching the blinking lights outside the window. Airports always felt strangely emotional at dawn. People arriving, leaving, starting over. The cabin doors finally opened and passengers began standing in the aisle with tired expressions and wrinkled jackets. I waited calmly while the first-class section emptied. When I stepped into the terminal, cool morning air drifted through the corridor carrying the faint smell of coffee and rain. My phone vibrated almost immediately. A message from my driver. Waiting outside Terminal 3. Black Escalade. Another message appeared beneath it from my assistant reminding me about Monday morning meetings downtown. I slipped the phone back into my pocket just as my family emerged farther down the terminal. My mother spotted me first. There was hesitation in the way she approached now, as if she no longer trusted the version of me she had carried in her head for years. "Do you already have transportation arranged?" she asked carefully. "Yes." Howard adjusted the collar of his coat and forced a friendly smile. "We rented a sedan for Napa. You should join us for breakfast before heading to your hotel." I almost laughed quietly at how different his tone sounded from yesterday afternoon. Respect changes people faster than time ever does. "I appreciate it," I said, "but I already have plans." Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. "You always disappear." I looked at her for a second. I learned that from this family. Silence settled between us. Not dramatic, just heavy enough to make everybody uncomfortable. We continued walking through the terminal together past luxury storefronts and glowing advertisement screens while rolling suitcases rattled across polished floors. Then my mother suddenly slowed her pace beside me. "Caleb," she said quietly, "what exactly do you do now?" There it was. The question she had never bothered asking before success became visible. I kept walking. Technology investments. Software. A few companies. Howard looked genuinely stunned. A few companies? Before I could answer, my phone lit up again in my hand with a banking notification connected to an international transfer scheduled for Monday morning. Normally, I would not even look at it in public, but instinct made me glance down briefly while walking. The screen illuminated for only a second. Long enough. I saw my mother's eyes drop toward the number before I locked the phone again. She stopped walking completely. So did Vanessa. The amount displayed on the screen was more money than my mother had probably imagined I would earn in 10 lifetimes. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Around us, travelers hurried toward baggage claim while overhead speakers announced arrivals from Denver and Boston. Life kept moving normally around the exact moment my family's entire understanding of me collapsed. My mother stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not disappointment. Not pity. Something closer to shock mixed with regret. Her hand trembled slightly around the handle of her suitcase. "Caleb," she said softly, almost breathless, "is that really your account?" I looked at her calmly for a long moment before answering. "Yes," I said. "It always surprises people how much can change while they are busy underestimating you." My mother kept staring at me even after we reached baggage claim. The large carousel turned slowly beneath bright fluorescent lights while exhausted travelers crowded around waiting for suitcases to appear. Somewhere nearby, a child cried softly while airport announcements echoed overhead. Everything around us felt ordinary except the silence between my family and me. Vanessa was the first to speak again. "You could have told us," she said carefully. Not accusing. Not warm either. Just unsettled. I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and watched the conveyor belt begin moving. Would it have mattered? Neither of them answered immediately. That told me enough. My mother adjusted the scarf around her neck again, a nervous habit she had whenever she lost control of a conversation. "Of course it would have mattered," she said finally. I looked at her calmly. "You stopped asking about my life years ago." Howard cleared his throat softly beside her, clearly uncomfortable now that the balance in the room had shifted. "Families misunderstand each other sometimes," he said diplomatically. I almost smiled at that. Misunderstanding was forgetting somebody's birthday. What happened inside my family had been something quieter, more permanent. It was years of assumptions hardening into identity. Years of entering rooms already judged before I spoke. My suitcase finally appeared on the carousel. Simple black carry-on. No designer labels. No polished leather. I reached for it while memories kept surfacing in fragments I had spent years trying to forget. My college graduation. Vanessa receiving applause for law school acceptance while my mother introduced my software company as his little project. Thanksgiving dinners where relatives asked when I planned to get a stable job. Phone calls that slowly stopped coming after my first business collapsed. Nobody in my family had ever hated me. That was the strange part. They had simply decided I was the disappointment and organized reality around that idea. Caleb, my mother said quietly behind me. Why did you never come home more often? I turned slowly toward her. Because every visit felt like an evaluation. Her expression tightened. I could see guilt beginning to settle into places pride used to live. But the thing about late realizations is that they still arrive late. We started walking toward the terminal exit together. Outside the glass walls, black cars lined the pickup area while fog drifted across the parking structure lights. My phone buzzed again with another message from my assistant confirming investor meetings for the week. My mother noticed the name at the top of the screen before I locked it. Executive assistant. She looked away immediately afterward. I thought you were struggling all these years, she admitted softly. I nodded once. I know. She stopped walking for a second. Why did you let us believe that? That question almost made me laugh. Because buried inside it was the same assumption she had always carried. That I somehow owed people proof of my worth before deserving respect. I looked at the sliding airport doors opening ahead of us and answered honestly. Because the people who truly care about you usually believe in you before the results arrive. My mother lowered her eyes after that. And for the first time in my life, Diane Whitmore looked like someone realizing she had spent years loving her son conditionally without ever meaning to. Outside the terminal, the cold San Francisco air carried the smell of rain and jet fuel while black SUVs and hotel shuttles moved slowly through the crowded pickup lanes. My driver stood near the curb holding a small sign with my last name printed neatly across it. The second Howard noticed the vehicle waiting behind him, his entire posture changed again. The Escalade was polished black with tinted windows and a suited driver opening the rear passenger door before I even reached the curb. Small details. Expensive details. The kind my mother had spent her entire life associating with importance. Caleb, she said suddenly before I stepped forward, wait a second. I turned back toward her. Diane Whitmore looked unusually uncertain standing there beside her luggage. The confidence she carried so naturally earlier at the airport in Chicago had softened into something more fragile now. We are staying in Napa for a few days, she said carefully. You should come join us for dinner tomorrow night. Vanessa nodded quickly beside her. Daniel would love to meet you again. And honestly, it would be nice to spend time together like a real family. A real family. The phrase settled strangely in my chest. Because families usually notice when somebody is drowning long before they become successful enough to impress strangers. Howard stepped forward with an awkward smile. I know a few investors in the Bay Area, he said. Maybe there are opportunities for collaboration. I almost admired how quickly people learn new language once money entered the room. Earlier, I had been the family disappointment. Now suddenly, I was a connection worth keeping close. My driver quietly loaded my suitcase into the back of the SUV while rain began misting lightly across the sidewalk. My mother folded her arms against the cold and looked at me more softly than she had all day. We really have missed you, she said. That one almost hurt more than the insults from earlier. Because part of me believed she meant it. People can care about you and still fail you at the same time. That was one of the hardest lessons adulthood teaches. I looked at my family standing together beneath the terminal lights. Same faces I had spent years trying to earn approval from. Same people who only seemed curious about my life once success became visible enough to validate. I have meetings all week, I said politely. Things are busy right now. My mother lowered her eyes slightly. Maybe next month then. I gave a small nod without promising anything. The truth was, I no longer knew how to return to relationships that had always depended on performance. Love attached to achievement never feels entirely safe afterward. Vanessa stepped closer and touched my arm lightly. You know, she said quietly, Mom used to worry about you constantly. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Worry and respect are not the same thing. Nobody spoke after that. Rain tapped softly against the roof of the SUV while airport traffic crawled past in blurred lines of red brake lights. My driver waited patiently beside the open door. Finally, my mother smiled faintly, though sadness lingered behind it now. You seem different, she said. I glanced toward the city skyline, barely visible through the fog ahead of us. No, I answered softly. I just stopped needing people to believe in me before I believed in myself. I slid into the back seat of the Escalade while my driver closed the door quietly. Behind me, the noise from the airport softened instantly, replaced by the low hum of the engine and the muted sound of rain against the windows. Outside, my family still stood near the curb beneath the gray morning sky. My mother held her coat tightly around herself, while Vanessa said something to Howard that I could not hear through the glass. For a second, none of them moved. They just watched the vehicle sitting there like they were trying to reconcile two completely different versions of me at once. The struggling son they thought they understood, and the man quietly leaving without needing anything from them anymore. Downtown office first, Mr. Whitmore? My driver asked. Yes, I answered softly. The SUV pulled slowly away from the curb and merged into the wet morning traffic outside the terminal. San Francisco drifted past the windows in blurred colors and pale fog, while my phone continued vibrating with messages from investors, assistants, and executives waiting for me downtown. A life my family never bothered asking about until they accidentally saw evidence of it. I leaned back into the seat and closed my eyes briefly. Strange thing was, I did not feel victorious. That was the part nobody talks about when people imagine success changing everything. Sometimes success only reveals who believed in you before there was anything to gain from it. My thoughts drifted back to all the small moments that once felt enormous. Sitting alone in my apartment eating microwave dinners because every dollar mattered. Listening to relatives joke about my phases during holidays. Watching my mother light up with pride talking about Vanessa while introducing me with careful sympathy. None of those moments destroyed me individually. But together, over years, they taught me something dangerous. They taught me to expect doubt from people who were supposed to know me best. The SUV stopped briefly at a red light, overlooking the bay. Rain moved softly across the windshield while early morning joggers crossed the street carrying coffee cups and umbrellas. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from my mother. I am sorry if I ever made you feel unseen. I stared at the message for several seconds without replying, because the truth was more complicated than simple forgiveness. Diane Whitmore had loved me in the way many parents do. Imperfectly. She celebrated potential when it looked impressive and withdrew belief when success took too long to arrive. She never intended to wound me. But intentions do not erase years of quiet dismissal. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Outside the window, the city skyline slowly emerged through the fog ahead of us. Clean glass towers, morning lights, new meetings, new people, a life built almost entirely in silence. Everything okay back there, sir? The driver asked politely. I looked out at the waking city for a long moment before answering. Yes, I said quietly. I think I finally understand something. What is that? I watched the rain slide slowly down the glass beside me. Some people only see your value after the rest of the world confirms it for them. The driver nodded politely, though I do not think he fully understood what I meant. Maybe that was fine. Some realizations are not meant to be explained out loud. They are simply carried forward like old scars hidden beneath expensive suits and calm voices. And as the city opened before me through the fog, I realized something else too. The best part of my success was never the money. It was no longer needing permission to believe in myself.